Welcome into the Jazz Notes podcast. I'm Ben Anderson, recording this today on December 9th. It is a Monday. I appreciate everybody who tunes in. As always, find me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. Find me on Blue Sky at Ben's Hoops. You can find me on Instagram, etc. And, of course, read everything I do at KSLSports.com. Usually have Chandler Holt here. He is off today, but hoping to be back with him next week. There might be some solo podcasts through the rest of the year, through the holiday season. And then we'll get back to normal coming up in January, but hopefully it's not too big of an interruption if you are a dedicated listener, which, speaking of which, really honored to see everybody who did their Spotify Wrapped or, podcast Wrapped, what episodes you listen to or shows you listen to most, to see the Jazz Notes podcast pop up, and quite a few of those was very cool and truly means a lot. So we appreciate everybody who does listen regularly, and to the point where it would be one of the podcasts you listen to most this year is cool. I promise you. It's rewarding for us to do the podcast, and to see that people actually enjoy it means a lot to us. All right, we'll talk about some news and notes. We'll talk about the week that was for the Utah Jazz, and we'll get to a mailbag. Looks like a bit of an abbreviated mailbag today. I get people are on their in their holiday thinking right now, and probably don't have the Utah Jazz first and foremost, but we will answer the questions that you have sent in. Let's look back at the week that was for the Utah Jazz quickly. A weird one. 2 ugly blowouts, and then their most lopsided victory in a couple of years. The Jazz get blown out and play what I think was probably their worst game of the season. Maybe I just have a short memory and don't remember some of those first 7 losses of the year where the offense wasn't working at all. But they lose to the Oklahoma City Thunder, get absolutely blown off the floor, can't even bring the ball up the court. They just kept turning it over and over and over, and they lose 133 to 106. It was the final in-season tournament game. Jazz finish 0-4 in tournament play, which leads to their brief hiatus they've got coming up this week. But that was particularly ugly. They go into Portland. Lauri Markkanen's a late scratch. And even though Portland wasn't certainly healthy, they were healthier than the Jazz were, Portland absolutely no-showed in this game. Jazz beat them 141 to 99. Basically everything that could go well for the Jazz did. Everything that could go wrong for the Thunder did, for the Trailblazers did as well. The Jazz looked like they were having fun. They looked like they needed a win, and I know a lot of Jazz fans out there who are rooting for the team to be in the Cooper Flag sweepstakes. Hate to see any win there is. I would just say, every once in a while, for the mental health of these guys, and I get you roll your eyes, they make millions of dollars. I think that's totally fair. You got to have a win. You got to see the work pay off. You just got to get some of the relief from these long losing streaks, and they did that against Portland. John Collins had 20 points. Johnny Juzang had 22 points. He was the leading scorer. But 9 players in double digits. It was one of the, I think the first time in franchise history the Jazz have ever done that, had 9 guys score in double digits. So it really was a complete effort. They played well. And then the quick turnaround Sunday in Sacramento last night, and they were as bad against the Kings as they were good against the Trailblazers. They manage only 97 points. They give up 141 points. Keontae George scores 25. John Collins scores 19. Colin Sexton, scores 15. But I didn't think Colin was particularly impactful. Maybe Lauri Markkanen's worst game in a Jazz uniform. 8 points, 2 rebounds, 25 minutes, 2 of 9 shooting, 0 of 4 from the floor. I wonder if his back is bothering him or what the story is there. But he certainly was not fantastic in this game. And then I thought the major story was how badly the bench played. The bench got outscored 60-22. They are just so young right now. Remember before the Kyle Filipowski injury, John Collins was coming off the bench and provided some veteran leadership. Jordan Clarkson was still in the lineup before that injury, and that really helped that second unit have some vets playing and just kind of stabilize everything. Without them, and with John Collins in the starting lineup, you've got Johnny Juzang, Bryce Sensabaugh, Isaiah Collier, Micah Potter, and Kyle Filipowski all playing minutes off the bench. Yes, it's buoyed a little bit by veterans and Drew Eubanks, and even Svi Mikhailiuk got on the floor last night. But that's so many first, second, and third-year players trying to compete with guys like Kevin Huerter, guys like Jordan McLaughlin, guys like even Doug McDermott, who got in the game late, who have more games played individually than all of those first, second, and third-year guys for the Jazz have played combined, and you're going to get blown off the floor. And, there's something to be said about maximizing playing time for your youngsters, getting Isaiah Collier as many minutes as possible, getting Johnny Juzang as many minutes as possible, getting Bryce Sensabaugh as many minutes as possible. I believe in that, not if they're getting run off the floor, not if they're being fed to the Lions. I don't think you want to do that. So I think I will be keeping an eye over the next 4 days the Jazz have off, and then, of course, coming back on Friday against the Suns, how the Jazz manage that lineup. Did they put Kyle Filipowski back into the starting lineup? He was rough last night. He did not look good, but that's understandable after 7 games off. He's not going to be ready to go as a rookie. But does he get pushed back into the starting lineup to move John Collins back to the bench? And then does Jordan Clarkson return from plantar fasciitis at any point coming up here? Those are a couple of things to keep an eye on coming up this week. As I mentioned, Jazz host the Suns on Friday and then have the Clippers game on Monday. So those will be, I guess we only have one game that we'll talk about before next week when we record. But a light week due fully to the NBA Cup. The NBA Cup is going to be played over the next week. The tournament and the quarterfinals and then going into the semifinals. Jazz obviously going 0-4 did not qualify for that. And as a result, they get a little bit of a mini break, 4 days off here before playing on Friday, which I think they will gladly take. Maybe Jordan gets healthier. Maybe Kyle Filipowski gets healthier. Maybe Lauri Markkanen's back gets healthier. And they get a home game. And more importantly, even though they're playing, 8 of these 9 games in December on the road, they get to be in Salt Lake City for the next 5 days, 6 days. They probably don't fly out until Sunday, and we'll play the Clippers on Monday night. So they're going to get 5 straight nights in Salt Lake City in their own beds, which I'm sure they're very happy about, and only have a game one of those nights. So a really nice opportunity before the holidays to spend some time with their families and get a break. If we were going to do our predictions on how the Jazz would fare, I'd probably say 0-1. I think the Suns, who are not very good when Kevin Durant doesn't play, are still probably better than the Jazz and probably have a chance to get this win coming up on Friday night. With that said, let's look at where the Jazz are in the standings. After this last week, they currently sit at 5-18. It's the 4th slowest start to the season in franchise history. They've had 2 4-19 starts, including their last quote-unquote disastrous season when they ended up drafting Dante Exum. They were 4-19 through 23 games there. They also did it in 1979, and then really early in their inception, the New Orleans Jazz had a 2-21 stretch to start the year. So not the worst start in franchise history, but 5-18, certainly far from the best. And I don't think this was all that difficult to see coming. They didn't replace veterans in the second unit and in their depth chart. We knew this was going to be a difficult year for the Jazz, designed specifically to play their young guys a lot, which is happening, and to improve their draft stock, which is also happening. Jazz are in 28th in the league overall, only 30 teams. Washington has the worst record at 3-19. So the Jazz are a game and a half ahead of them, including 2 wins, which I guess would be the hard part, the losses. You expect losses for bad teams. You don't expect wins. So when you have a 2-win advantage, it feels bigger than just a game and a half. And then the same can be said for Portland, or I should say New Orleans in the West. The Jazz are 5-18. New Orleans technically has a worse record than the Jazz because they're 5-20. I would only look at the win total. I wouldn't worry about the loss total. If you expect the Jazz to lose their next 2 games, then basically it's a little bit of a Schrodinger's cat, but they are tied with the Pelicans in the win column. That's ultimately all that matters. Toronto's starting to win a couple more games. They are in the 27th spot in the NBA. They are 7-17, so they have 2 more wins and 1 fewer loss, so that's the advantage there. And then even though the Jazz blew Portland out, and Portland's going to be, probably prioritizing their draft pick by the end of the year, I still think they probably finish with a better record than the Jazz. So not anywhere to concern, or no reason to be majorly concerned if you're a Jazz fan wanting to up the draft stock of the team going into the offseason. I don't think they have won too many games at this point in the year for that to be a concern. All right, news and notes from the week, what we saw, what the trends were. I thought Keontae had a really, really good week, and I think that was promising because he had a terribly slow start to the season. I thought he picked it up a little bit, and I thought, okay, maybe this is who he is for the rest of the year. That's promising. And then, man, he really struggled again. And I was worried, is this just going to be a bad run for Keontae? Is he just not the guy who he's shown flashes of? And again, it's only flashes. But over these last 3 games, I think Keontae George was clearly the best player on the Jazz's roster. Certainly over the last 2 games he was. But he was the team's leading scorer this past week. He was at 19.3 points per game. Most importantly, shooting better from the floor, 51% from the floor, 33% from 3. Again, I'm not that worried about. That's a little bit fluky. He's a make and miss player, as are most players in the NBA. But what I really liked is how hard he played. And I thought that was reflected in his 4.7 rebounds per game. When Keontae plays hard, he's really good. And I guess it's a little bit of a red flag to say, I can see when you're playing hard. Like, you just want guys to play hard all the time, especially young guys who are trying to carve out their role in the NBA. I do think there's probably a thing with Keontae where he's so talented and so gifted naturally and has so many skills that he probably hasn't had to play hard most of his life to be better than everybody else on the floor. If he has that skill set and then matches it with the ability to play hard, I think he's a really high-level NBA player and has a high ceiling, but it shouldn't be, I guess, as noticeable when he plays hard as it was the last two games. He played really hard in Portland. I thought he played really hard in Sacramento, and as a result was probably the Jazz's best player on the floor. Again, leading scorer of the team over the last three games, and the effort was there. He had 4 steals against the Kings, even though the Jazz were getting blown out. That would be a really major sign of growth for Keontae if he is just playing harder more often than not when he's on the court. And look, I don't think it's that uncommon. Last year, I don't think Walker Kessler played that hard. I thought Walker was really good his first year and was excited to be in the NBA. It kind of was able to sneak up on a lot of people. And then year 2, everyone saw him coming and prepared for him and beat him up. And he kind of checked out and wasn't playing that hard and came back in year 3. And he's just busting his butt now and he's playing so hard. And Walker has turned into a star player. I mean, not an all-star, but I mean, he's one of the better players on this Jazz roster. And over his last 3 games, he had 12.7 points. He's 14 rebounds a game. He's almost 4 blocks, 3.7. Like, he's playing truly awesome basketball right now. And a lot of it is because he is talented. He has great physical gifts, but the effort is there. He's playing really hard. Keontae's the same thing. Good physical gifts, probably not as good as Walker, but super talented. Has a lot of things going for him in his game. Has a deep bag of tricks. When he plays hard and puts it together, he looks really good, and that's what's happened. So you hope something has gotten through to him where he's just playing a little bit harder and continues to play well as a result. Another good week for John Collins, 18 points, shooting an unbelievable 69% from the three-point line. That's just over the last 3 games. But John Collins this year has been great. He has been a much better player than I expected for the season. John Collins, after an okay year last year shooting the ball, but certainly felt like an odd fit with the Jazz, never really found his niche. He's shooting 43%. He's the Jazz's leading three-point shooter as far as percentage goes at 43% on 3.1 attempts per game, so a pretty reasonable sample size. Colin Sexton's number 2 at 43%. Bryce Sensabaugh is number 3 at 41%. Lauri Markkanen at 5, just behind Micah Potter at 37%. So some good numbers for the Jazz. These guys are starting to come around a little bit on their shooting, and John Collins has been just really, really impressive. 18 points, 8 rebounds, 2.5 assists. And he's in the 50, 40, 90 club at the moment, which would be one of the all-time great shockers in NBA history if John Collins joins, it's like Mark Price and Larry Bird and Steph Curry, the very few people who have ever been able to do it. He's at 53% on field goals, 43% on threes, and 92% from the free throw line. He's having an awesome year. I'll be curious how the Jazz want to treat that. Do they really shop him at the trade deadline? Is he a guy who they think, this is good enough that if he can play this way, maybe he's a guy you want to have in your rotation? And how they look at that. That will be one of the bigger storylines, I think, for the Jazz coming up for the rest of the season. Other news and notes, Isaiah Collier was sent to the G League today. With 4 days off, they may just be sending him down there to play and expect to bring him back by Friday. Again, they just don't have a lot of point guard depth, and I don't think they want to play Patty Mills. Or they could turn to Bryce Sensabaugh and say, Bryce, you're going to play. They've certainly been toying with Svi Mykhailiuk playing a little bit more, so maybe Bryce takes over some of those backup point guard minutes, which they have toyed with at times. I know I've asked Will Hardy about it a bunch of times, and he's been a little hesitant to commit to it. And look, Bryce is better when he shoots and not when he dribbles. So maybe that's not the idea, but maybe they're giving Bryce a little bit more opportunity to handle the ball. And Svi will play a little bit more. Svi's been, I think, a good soldier sitting and waiting to play and has played more over these last couple of days and has been okay. He plays hard. And I think that gives some semblance of real basketball that we haven't seen a lot from the second unit when they are fully young and not competing very well. So keep an eye on what happens with Isaiah Collier. And then Cody Williams has been a success in the G League. And maybe because of Cody Williams' success, the Jazz say, let's get Isaiah down there as well and let him play some more minutes. Again, the Jazz, it's just hard to play 11 guys. And that's kind of where they have to be. And that's what you saw last night versus the Kings. They're just playing a ton of players. You've got your starting 5 with Keontae and Walker and Lowry and John Collins and Colin Sexton. And then your second unit, Johnny Juzang's going to play. Bryce is going to play. Kyle Filipowski's going to play. Drew Eubanks is going to play. You're at 9 guys, and then the question is, do you want to play Svi Mykhailiuk, or do you want to play Isaiah Collier? And they've, defaulted to certainly playing Isaiah over Svi, but he is really struggling. Isaiah Collier has not been able to find the bottom of the net for a while now. For the season, he's shooting 31% from the floor, 14% from the three-point line and 44% from the free throw line, that was the book on him. He has some playmaking chops. He cannot shoot in the slightest. And he was able to get away with some of it by being bigger than everybody at the college level. I mean, just physically stronger. That's not going to be the case for him in the NBA. He had a better game against Portland. He shot 5 of 13 from the floor, scored a career high 12 points, but it's pretty rough. It's been pretty rough going for Isaiah, and I think he'd certainly benefit from playing some extra minutes in the G League right now, just to find out what works and what doesn't work the same way I think it has worked a little bit for Cody Williams, and finding the shots he can take, and take as many as you want, make mistakes, and don't feel like you're letting down the whole team, because the G League is about making mistakes, and it's just fine if you do it. All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we will get to your mailbag questions. Stick around. More Jazz Notes coming up next. Welcome back to the Jazz Notes podcast. Ben Anderson. All right, let's get to the mailbag. As always, I send out a prompt on Twitter and Blue Sky at Ben's Hoops on Mondays when we record this, asking, what are your Jazz questions? What are your NBA questions? We will answer them on the podcast. And I'm actually going to take one that was a response that wasn't actually to that prompt, but I think it's an interesting launching point. We also have kind of a lighter mailbag today, so this will add another question to address. And it's in regards to Isaiah Collier going to the G League. And Jimmy Robinson on Twitter says, Will Hardy's an excellent coach, but I'm getting concerned about the player development ability of him and his staff. I do think when you look at comparing Will Hardy and Quinn Snyder, one of the things that you would jump out immediately and look at is all the success stories of development that Quinn Snyder had, or was perceived to have, with the Jazz. And I think actually it's very fair. Like, George Niang got a lot better playing in Utah. Joe Ingles seemed to get a lot better playing in Utah, though Joe was far more of a finished product when he got here because of his age and how much professional basketball he had played overseas before he joined the NBA. But he certainly got better. And then, of course, what you saw from the first year of Rudy Gobert under Ty Corbin, he comes to the Jazz, is, a backup for the first half of the season. I think by the second half of his sophomore season, he's a full-time starter. And by year 3, he's like a legitimate dude. Of course, the development of Donovan Mitchell was astronomical. He was good quick, but got much better while he was here. And now look, he's even better in Cleveland than he ever was with the Jazz. He's playing great basketball right now. So there are some clear success stories with Quinn Snyder that you can look back at and say, yeah, obviously he's a really good coach and he's really good at doing that. And I think it's accurate. I mean, I think the Jazz were really good at developing players under Quinn Snyder. One thing I think is probably good, though, to realize in that situation is, are we doing it after year 3, or are we doing it, and look, not even year 3, if we're doing apples to apples with Will Hardy, are you doing it at the second month of his third year, like we did with Quinn Snyder? And how would we be looking at the Jazz then? That would have been the 2016-2017 season for the Jazz, and they certainly play better, and they are improving, but they do not have Donovan Mitchell on the roster yet. This was the year before Donovan joined the team. You have Gordon Hayward, you have Rudy Gobert, you have George Hill, you have Rodney Hood, Ingles, Favors, Joe Johnson is there, Dante is there, Boris Diaw's on that team, Trey Lyles is on that team. So I guess if we wanted to really look at this, like, the Jazz never developed Trey Lyles. In fact, there was a disconnect between Trey and Quinn and the expectation for practice that resulted in Trey being traded after his first year, which, yes, lucked into Donovan Mitchell, and that was good work by the Jazz's front office. But, they didn't develop Trey. They didn't really develop Dante Exum. Dante Exum got better going to Europe before he came back over. I know he could never stay healthy, but he didn't really get better. I do think Gordon got better, but Gordon was always on that trajectory. And then, yes, Rudy Gobert ends up finishing All-NBA second team and Defensive Player of the Year, number 2 overall in just his third season. That was a crazy trajectory for him. But, Rodney Hood didn't really click in, and he was given the opportunity was going to be there for Rodney to take over for Gordon in the next season. And, of course, Donovan Mitchell comes in and takes that job, and Rodney Hood doesn't really have a lot of success. So I guess if we were to compare Will to Quinn, which I don't think is always fair, the situations are totally different with the number of veterans that were on that team that kind of gave you a softer landing for somebody like Rudy Gobert to find his starting spot and his position and how much success he was going to have. But also there were just guys who didn't hit. Rodney Hood did not hit here all that well in his opportunity to develop, and some of that came before Quinn was here, certainly, but he didn't turn into a star just because Quinn was able to develop other guys. Same could be said for Dante Exum. And look, the year before that, the Jazz gave up on Trey Burke, who didn't develop under Quinn either, and had some flaws learning under Ty Corbin. So I'm not sure we would have recognized how good Quinn was and that staff was at it after just, 2 seasons and 20 games, like where Will Hardy is right now. But I would point and say, Johnny Juzang's gotten a lot better over the last 2.5 years. He came in as a, afterthought, undrafted player, played 2 seasons in the G League, only one of them with Wojciechowski last year, and has turned into a, developing NBA player. I thought Taylor Hendricks did look a lot better at the start of the season compared to what happened last season. And, of course, we're not going to know because he's out for the year with the leg injury. And then I think Bryce is playing a lot better. I mean, I think there's a real chance that Bryce and Taylor last year to start the season, had you thrown them out there and let them play a lot of minutes early, the same way Cody Williams did this year, they would look just like Cody Williams. They'd look just like Isaiah Collier. Like, so far from being ready to contribute at an NBA level that you would have thought, ooh, are these guys busts? And Bryce is not a bust. I think you can see that. Like, Bryce can play. And I thought Taylor looked like he could really play. So I think it's probably a little bit too early. And then also important to remember, like, the Jazz didn't have a draft pick in 2022. They ended up, trading everybody, and they ended up with Walker Kessler and Ochai Agbaji. By the way, Walker's developed excellently well, so he's another developmental success story. They traded Ochai early to open up opportunities for other guys and get that draft pick back, and that might end up being a mistake. We'll see. Ochai's playing okay. He's getting a lot of opportunities. He's really shooting the ball well. We'll see what type of a player he turns into with Toronto. But the Jazz didn't have their own first-round pick that year. So they signed Johnny Juzang. He was kind of one of their rookies that they brought in that they didn't trade for. You know what? I also add that they brought in Simone Fontecchio, who by year 2 was playing well. So I guess, Jimmy, I don't totally agree with the idea that the Jazz haven't had the same developmental success stories. When you don't have necessarily the high-level draft picks to develop, I think that does get difficult. And maybe you don't hit as well in the draft on some of your later picks. But even then, I think they've done pretty well. And I think maybe as we look at this in year 4, year 5, et cetera, with Will Hardy, we'll start to get a better picture of whether or not he's good at this. But I think there's as many signs that he is good at it, and probably more than the idea that he might not be. All right, let's get into the actual mailbag questions. Again, as always, find me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops, or read us at KSLSports.com and retweet it there as well. Cisco, with the likelihood of next year's pick, 2026, being either top 8 or going to Oklahoma City, is there a way for the Jazz to trade the Minnesota or Cleveland pick swaps? No and yes. So what you can do, I think what you're asking, Cisco, is can you just trade the ability to swap picks to another team alone and say, like, that's what you're including, not including your own pick? No, you can't do that. You can't just say, like, oh, well, now this other team can swap the pick. I don't believe you have the rights to do that. You can do it with your own pick. I don't know if I've ever heard of another team trading previous swap rights that they got from another team to somebody else. What you can do essentially is say, all right, I'm a hypothetical. The Jazz are going to trade their 2026 first round pick to the Nets. What the Jazz can do is say the Nets either get the best of those draft picks, and they kind of call this a super swap, or the second best of those draft picks. So it would be 3 firsts, right? The Jazz would have a pick. The Nets would have a pick because that's the Jazz swap that they're trading. And then there's also the Minnesota or Cleveland swap in there. Remember, the Jazz can't swap both the Cleveland and Minnesota swap. You just take the best swap possible, if it even applies. And it may not apply. It probably won't. Jazz are going to have the worst pick of those 3 next year, most likely, barring something crazy happening, as long as they hold on to their pick. And again, that's the other aspect of this. They have to be top 8 to be able to hold on to this swap. So the Jazz could make a trade with a team that says, well, if we end up with the 3rd pick, you will get that best pick. We will take the second best pick, whether that comes from Cleveland or Minnesota or Brooklyn in this situation where you're making that trade. And then, of course, Minnesota or Cleveland still gets the worst of those trades. You can do that. That is still possible. But no, I don't think you have the ability to just separate out this idea of, okay, well, we will let you swap picks with Minnesota and we're just going to hold on to our own pick. You basically do that the night of the draft when you choose to swap picks or not. So I don't think you can separate it out. I could be wrong, but I think logically that's kind of how it applies. I do think that, again, having a number 8 overall pick or having it being top 8 protected gives you a real sign that the Jazz, A, are pretty far away from competing, and B, that like you're probably better off, again, just going for the Boozers or A.J. DeBonsta, who, by the way, is announcing his decision of where he's going to go tomorrow morning. And my understanding is BYU is very firmly in the running for that. Sounds like it's going to be BYU or Alabama. I think he's also got North Carolina in there. So we will see. That's going to be an interesting one to watch. But no, I don't think you can just separate out a swap of some other team and trade it without including yours to do a kind of a 3-team swap situation. And honestly, I don't think the Jazz are going to swap. Cleveland's really good. Minnesota is dysfunctional at the moment. They feel like they're getting better. I'm not sure I buy that. And they are, of course, like most teams, one injury away from things really falling apart. But they are so reliant on guys like Rudy or guys like Ant that if they were to lose them for any extended period, they'd be in real trouble and could miss the playoffs. Right now, they're in the play-in tournament in the West if it were to start today, but are only like a game or two ahead of Sacramento and some of those other teams on the outside looking in. Good question, Cisco. I wish I had a clear answer. In all honesty, I tried to even do some research on it, and I couldn't find like a true answer on it. But looking at the logical explanations of how pick swaps work, it's not really possible. Derek Nem says, I think it's Nem. I apologize if I'm saying it wrong. Which former Jazz players were the most delightful to interact with from a media perspective? There's a long list of guys, and I'll just throw out kind of the obvious ones. Like Rudy was great because he always had something to say, and sometimes it was controversial, but Rudy always had something to say. That was helpful. Donovan, really, for as big of a star as he is, was great at the media, and I know a lot of people thought he was tricky like a fox. They thought because of his dad's role in professional sports with the New York Mets that he'd kind of been trained on how to handle things perfectly. There probably is a little bit of that. I liked Donovan quite a bit. I enjoyed talking to him, so I thought he was always enjoyable. I will say right now, like I just think Jordan Clarkson's one of the most enjoyable people I've ever been around. I really like Jordan a ton, and from a media perspective, selfishly, even though he hasn't done much this year because he hasn't played a whole lot, and he's just kind of the veteran on the team, so he's not talking as much as he once did because he recognizes this year is about the young guys. Jordan's tenure is going to place him, whatever happens, whether they trade him or he sticks around long term. Jordan is going to be on this list of Hall of Fame players to talk to, interesting people, fun in the community. I've really, really enjoyed Jordan Clarkson, the person, and had some very memorable interactions with him. But going back further than that, man, there's like nice guys who aren't necessarily good for the media. Like Derek Favors is one of the nicest people. He's just a very sweet kid, but didn't talk, didn't say much, so I wouldn't put him on this list. My favorite, and the name that jumps out to me immediately when you ask this question, Derek, is Randy Foye. I loved Randy Foye. He had a super interesting backstory. If you don't remember, I think he was raised by his grandparents. Both of his parents had been lost, and there was some kind of tragic background there. He was raised by his grandparents. This has kind of nothing to do with it, but it's just part of his interesting story. His organs were reversed. As strange as that sounds, like all of his organs were on the wrong side of his body. They had been flipped. It's like a super rare genetic thing. So he just was this long shot overall and this undersized shooter who didn't really have point guard skills and had kind of all these flaws to his game. But man, he was really smart and really a delightful person. And I just loved having him around. He was always willing to talk. I was cutting my teeth in this business when he was on the roster. And I just thought he was fabulous. I thought he was really enjoyable. Richard Jefferson, there's a reason he's doing the media. There's a reason he's so good with ESPN and has been good with the Nets when he was their play-by-play guy or color analyst. He is super thoughtful. He's also very intelligent. He will give you answers. He kind of plays the game a little bit and, gives you some locker room talk. And I don't mean locker room talk as in like the doors closed locker room talk. I mean, like coach speak, but he's not a coach. So the way the players will kind of give you canned answers. He wove that into traditionally good answers. So he was insightful, but also kind of recognized like, hey, man, you might just need a quote for your story, and I'm going to give you something that actually is useful about the game, is maybe not the most important thing you've ever heard, but is useful to you and what you're trying to accomplish here as a young writer. So I really appreciated that. I loved Marvin Williams. Marvin Williams, again, like, you got to remember, this was the number 2 overall draft pick behind Andrew Bogut. What did that must have been? early 2000s. That was the same as the D. Will year, so like 05. Went to North Carolina, was the biggest recruit in the country, kind of in conversation to be the number one pick over throughout the whole year. Bogut had that crazy year at Utah and got picked number one overall. And in retrospect, that was a fine pick. I mean, obviously Chris Paul would go number one overall in a redraft there, but Bogut won a title and was good. Marvin Williams had a long career. That was a better draft than probably some people remember. But goes to Atlanta, never becomes a superstar, wasn't a bust, but, you draft a guy number 2 overall who was the number one recruit in the country, and they kind of are expected to be huge, huge players, and he wasn't, and he never let that kind of bring him down as a person. He was like one of the first guys to ever come to the Jazz that like had tattoos everywhere. Like you didn't see it necessarily. His whole body was tattooed. And again, that's not anything about him, but like a guy who kind of broke the mold from what the Jazz had traditionally had in Utah. And he was just awesome. He was just really nice and cordial and always gave you his time and had great answers. And I remember seeing like a lot of fan mail, and it always seemed like he responded to it. Just like weird things like that I was like, I really admired that as a player of like, that's a guy who could have said, man, I am just in Utah for a paycheck and I'm going to get out of here as quickly as possible. This is not for me. This is not an ownership group. Has traditionally embraced guys like me. And man, it was a bad team. And he came in and just played hard, and I thought was a super pro. So I've always loved Marvin Williams as a result of that. Who are some other guys? There are fun guys that have always been, every locker room has good guys. Thabo Sefolosha was awesome. The coolest player I've ever seen, Jordan Clarkson's in this conversation. It's just like raw coolness. There's a reason he gets invited to all these different worldwide events. Like Jordan Clarkson's a cool person. Is Joe Johnson. Joe Johnson was a bad dude. Man, that guy, he was the richest player at the time I'm sure I'd ever interacted with. I think he'd signed something like $250 million in contracts by the time he was playing with the Jazz. I mean, something absurd. He had 2 maxes that were all 9 digits and looked like it and felt like it, but wasn't a jerk about it. Like there are some guys who don't have time for you, and that's fine. I get it. I can be a nuisance, and sometimes people view media as the enemy. I don't think they necessarily need to, but if you do feel that way, I'm not going to fight you on it. Joe Johnson was just unbelievably well-dressed, well taken care of. And I mean, like, he took care of himself. He was a pro's pro. Again, very thoughtful. Signed in Utah for the money. Like, there was no qualms about it. Like, could have signed in Miami. He was like, well, the Jazz offered me $5 million more or whatever it was. And he said, I'm open to it. I'll come and play for more money. I want to be here for the money, which you could have a distaste for. But you know what? He paid off what he got paid for. Like, he won the Jazz a playoff series against the Clippers with that awesome first round. It's one of the better individual performances I've ever seen from a player in a playoff series for the Jazz. So he just felt like $250 million, but he didn't act like he wasn't arrogant about it. Like, you knew this guy had been very well taken care of financially, which you kind of can't always tell player to player, which I actually like. But Joe was cool. Joe Johnson was a very cool player. So that's another name I would throw on the list. I hate to leave anybody out, but of the guys I've really, really enjoyed, those are the 4 I'd probably say jump out to me the most. Rudy and Donovan, obviously. Richard Jefferson, Randy Foye, Marvin Williams really jump out. Jordan Clarkson will be on this list, and Joe Johnson's cool. So a couple of names there of guys I just truly thought were really, really fun people to be around and super enjoyable. And now, like, there's guys on this trip, like Micah Potter is the nicest person on the planet. Micah Potter right now is so kind. I've been doing a little series of asking guys if they put up their Christmas tree. I'm going to get a lot more of those out before the holiday, which is 2 weeks from tomorrow. I think I've got 6 or 7 of them, so I've got to edit them and put them together. But like, his answer is just very funny and charming. He's just a very nice guy. So I'm thankful. The league is full of nice people, and the Jazz value bringing in nice people. And as a result, it's made my life a lot easier. All right, that ended up being a longer mailbag than I expected, but I appreciate everyone who did send in the questions. I'm sorry we didn't have more, but it's the holidays. Again, I totally understand. So if you want to respond, love to have you do it. If not, we'll talk to you next week. As always, find me on Twitter at BensHoops, and you can read it at KSLSports.com. We'll be back next week.